achieve that here in Boston. Before we get to that, I have two very quick announcements. First, the podcast for our opening keynote panel, The Other Impacts of Corona, as well as our second panel from last week on co-creation are now both available through Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. This is where you will find all of our future podcasts as well. They're being released each Friday morning in advance of the next panel. So be sure to subscribe. Second, last week we announced the second slate of 4 panels, including discussions on cross-municipal collaboration, housing in Greater Boston, and supporting our youth. And just a reminder, our headlining keynote for that second slate, which will be on May 22nd, so 2 weeks from today, it will be at a different time. It will be at 11 a.m., and we'll continue to announce that. But it's going to be a great conversation on Boston innovation, past, present, and future with Paul Grogan, from the Boston Foundation, is going to be interviewed by Tiziana Deering of Radio Boston, and with responses from Councillor Michelle Wu, Tanisha Sullivan, president of the Boston chapter of the NAACP, and Catherine Lusk, co-director of BU's Initiative on Cities. So those are all the great things that you can listen to or do when you're not at this panel, so later on. But for today, to get to the reason why we're all here right now, today's panel is about achieving climate resilience together here in Boston. It's going to be moderated by Amy Longsworth, who is the director of the Green Ribbon Commission. I'm going to say a little bit about her and just the goal for the panel, but then I'm going to allow her to introduce the panelists and really frame the panel in her own terms, because she's really the expert and the leader here. The Green Ribbon Commission is bringing together private sector leaders, public officials, academics, and philanthropy to really determine how they can each contribute to Boston's 2030 climate action plan, how they can align their skills, resources, and needs with really this collective goal and this collective challenge we have of achieving climate resilience at a time when the climate is, as we might say, unstable, and we live in a coastal city that is severely at risk of things like rising floodwaters and such. The Green Ribbon Commission is strongly supported by the BARI Foundation, which I note as they are also a sponsor of the conference. So a very active foundation locally in terms of supporting these kinds of intersector collaborations. We really appreciate that on both ends. And I feel like this panel is a great one for building off of last week's, because it is, again, a true act of co-creation, right? We're really talking about how institutions from across the area, across many different sectors, work together to achieve something of a collective good. So I'm really excited about the conversation. As always, we are active on Twitter. If you'd like to participate that way, at BARI Boston, just shout us out, or hashtag BARI 2020. We are monitoring that, so if you ask questions through there, we will filter those over to the moderator. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Amy to lead us through.
Great, thank you, Dan. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I am Amy Longsworth, the director of the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, and we have 4 really great panelists with us today. Caitlin Spence from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, Dan Sittenfeld from the Museum of Science, Mike Walsh from Cadmus Associates, and Evan Curis from Boston University. And thank you all for preparing your remarks and taking the time to share your work with us today. We're going to be hearing a lot about the collection, analysis, and application of climate data. Perhaps a little dry for some people, but actually what's really interesting about this group, I think, is the way that they all work with some very unusual partners to collect information in surprise, and they're using it to inform some extremely important public policy issues related to climate, related to public health, related to transportation, that are going to shape our city and our region for decades to come. And the way they go about it is really, I think of it as sort of, in my lay terms, as putting science into the hands of people. It's not only a way to get very granular data, probably less expensively, one of the questions I have for you, but also to involve citizens and people in the climate issues in a very real and immediate way. A word about my own organization, which Dan described. We have 36 leaders of Boston institutions, and we are very much consumers of the kind of information that your four panelists today are producing. The Green Ribbon Commission was responsible for the Climate Ready Boston report and the Carbon Free Boston report, both of which were very data rich, and Mike Walsh here worked closely with us on the Carbon Free Boston report, and very supportive of the city's climate action plan, which was recently updated in 2019 and takes us out through 2030 and 2050. I do have one little advertisement to make, which is that the Green Ribbon Commission works on a set of sector-based working groups, and one of the sectors we work with is higher education, and with Northeastern is part of that group. And we are putting together a cross-institutional research collaborative to continue to help the city implement its climate action plan on a equitable basis. And in the light of the recent pandemic, or the current pandemic, I should say, we're really focusing in the short term on the relationship between the COVID-19 and city level climate action. We're looking for players, researchers, institutions, centers within universities, researchers who are interested in this question from whatever angle. We're at the beginning end of this. And if you are interested in collaborating with us, please be in touch. I am very easy to find. And now let's turn to our panelists. Each of them will present for about 7 or 8 minutes. Type in your questions as you go along. We'll take them all at the end after everyone has. And I'd like to start with Caitlin. Dr. Caitlin Spence is an analyst in data services at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and which serves about 101 cities in Greater Boston, in the Greater Boston area. Her work is focused on climate change adaptation, water management, and environmental quality. Caitlin?
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to share my screen now. Is that looking good?
Is looking good.
Okay. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to talk about our work, MAPC's work, mapping climate change exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity in the metropolitan Boston region. For those of you who don't know, MAPC is the regional planning agency serving the blue area in the logo above. So we're a quasi-state agency. Trying to move forward, I'm moving forward. So why is MAPC interested in mapping climate vulnerability? Climate change mitigation and adaptation are one of the major focus areas of MetroCom in 2050, MAPC's next regional plan update. Long-term thinking about what we want to look like in our region by 2050. We know that climate change impacts some populations more severely than others. It already has, and that will continue to be the case. When we're thinking about solutions, adaptation solutions, mitigation solutions, we need to prioritize the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change impacts, and this work tells us where they are. We also need to have the communities and people most impacted as active leaders and participants in those planning efforts. This framing of climate change vulnerability as exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity is nothing new. This is how the IPCC frames climate change vulnerability, and it's how climate change vulnerability is framed in our own state's hazard mitigation and climate change adaptation plan. And so just because I think maybe as an engineer in training, I tend to think, and many of us tend to think and talk more about solutions like seawalls and creative architecture. Thinking about the social dimensions of vulnerability are really important when we're trying to design solutions. As part of the work, we gathered many indicators sort of under each dimension. When we were thinking about climate sensitivity, we looked at age-related sensitivity indicators, areas where there are high concentrations of exposed occupations, health conditions that make people more sensitive to climate change hazards, and housing features and demographics like homes built before central air conditioning was common, or homes built before the flood insurance program. We also thought about adaptive capacity in sort of several different ways that are summarized here. Financial resources that people can use to adapt, and access to financial resources like loans, access to information, social networks, mobility. These are all resources and abilities that people can fall back on in a crisis and as they're thinking about adapting. Housing demographics like proportion of renters, just having control over the space where you live or a space to live. We also looked at things like English language isolation, race and ethnicity. We know that our region is segregated today, and that race and ethnicity continue to shape what it looks and feels like to be in our region. And unless we take active work to reverse that injustice, it's going to continue to limit adaptive capacity in the future. We broke down climate change exposure in terms of 3 hazards: heat-related hazards, sort of a status quo flood-related exposure, and exposure to future storm surge given sea level rise. I think the next talk is going to go into a lot of depth about heat. We looked at the heat-weighted percentage of housing units in a census tract that intersect a hotspot based on land surface temperature. When you're looking at sort of the status quo flooding, including both riverine flooding and storm surge, we used FEMA 1% special flood hazard areas to again look at the fraction of fraction of housing units in a census tract, sort of in that risk area. And we brought this framework to the future storm surge exposure metrics. Again, we looked at the future chance of flooding and calculated the percentage of housing units in that 1% chance area given 2 sea level rise scenarios. Diving into our results, we found that the census tracts most vulnerable to extreme heat were in some of the more built up areas that you might think of as being more prone to heat islands. So Lynn, Chelsea, Boston, and Framingham. However, in some of these more dense and built up areas, we see quite a bit of variation in terms of vulnerability. And that's really a product of bringing in not just exposure to extreme heat, but also sensitivity and adaptive capacity indicators. When we looked at our sort of status quo flood vulnerability, we see highly vulnerable tracts popping up in some of the same areas. Now, when we look at the interior, you might expect to see more vulnerability because of our region's richness in rivers. But what we found is that because there tends to be higher adaptive capacity in some of these more interior suburban communities, the vulnerability was lower on the whole. Unfortunately, the coastal storm surge data set that we had only covered parts of the inner core, but again, we saw high levels of vulnerability popping up in some of the denser urban areas. But again, there's quite a bit of variation in terms of how that translates into vulnerability rather than just exposure to storm surge hazards in the future. So you've seen the results. Some major takeaways I think are the most important parts of this work. I've talked about thinking about climate change solutions as changing the built environment. I just want to emphasize that I think this product shows how important it is to invest in social infrastructure and invest in reducing some of the health risks and barriers to adaptation that are preventing us reducing vulnerability to climate change. I also want to mention that our product maps where we have high concentrations of populations that we expect to be vulnerable to climate change, but every city and town that we work with will have some socially vulnerable populations. And so it's really important to bring this framework to all of our work. And I say that as someone at MAPC, and I hope all of us here. You can explore the maps that we created and download the data at climate-vulnerability.mapc.org. Our digital team did a fantastic job of putting together the product as sort of an interactive component. And this work is going to form our Metro Common 2050 process and form the way we do climate mitigation and adaptation work. So I hope you get a chance to check it out. I want to say thanks to Saliki Flingai, who is the main lead on this work, who is leaving us for the Vera Institute for Justice, and Jesse Partridge Guerrero, who is also, along with the other members of the team mentioned on the first slide, really instrumental in putting this together.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was really fascinating, and I do have some questions for you, but like everyone else, I will hold them until the end. I'd like to move on now. Wait a minute, let me turn my timer off here. There we go. Move on now to hear from David from the Museum of Science. David is the manager of forums and national collaborations at the museum. He's been an educator there for some 20 years and oversees projects in particular that pertain the intersection between science and society. He was the principal investigator for the Wicked Hot Boston campaign last summer. I think we're about to hear a lot more about that. And David, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy, for the introduction. And I'm going to try to build on some of the themes that Caitlin talked about so powerfully just now in the particular extreme context of extreme heat and a campaign that we hosted in Boston last summer called Wicked Hot Boston that you heard a little bit about just now. And I want to say that this work was supported by grants from the NOAA Office of Education and the NOAA Climate Program Office, and created with support from several of the partners that you see listed in this slide, including Northeastern University, which has, of course, a convening role in BARI. And I'm also a doctoral researcher in the Helmuth Lab there, and they were instrumental in some of the visualizations that we'll be sharing. So let's see if I can go forward here. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the policy and health context for extreme heat. People often think of flooding as a major concern for us here in Massachusetts, and it is, but extreme heat is also a major concern, and it's sometimes referred to as the silent storm because it kills more Americans each year than any other weather-related hazard. And this is connected to a lot of uncertainty in terms of what our vulnerabilities are going to look like. The picture that you see on the right-hand side is from the Climate Ready Boston report that Amy mentioned. And we may have a, yes.
Because you're, I think
you're, are you looking at the wrong thing?
Yeah, there we go.
Sorry about that. Okay, all right, I'll go without notes. Apologies, I had it all figured out. So what you're looking at on the right-hand side is a projection for the number of very hot days that will increase over Ready Boston before, and we may a climate more like the climate of Alabama, according to the Climate Ready Boston report. So this is a major concern and issues connected to justice. As we heard from our last speaker, Caitlin, not all people are going to experience these vulnerabilities the same. There are disparities connected to social inequities, and heat manifests itself that way. Did that adjust? Okay, the slide go forward, Amy? Okay. And so these heat vulnerabilities are exacerbated by something called the urban heat island effect, which Caitlin alluded to quickly. And I don't have detail on this because most people on the call will know that urban heat islands manifest themselves because of the physical form of urban spaces, because of the way that we build our cities and the way that heat is trapped in urban spaces at night because of the urban form. What we end up with is urban spaces that tend to be warmer than their surroundings, particularly at night. And what you're looking on the left-hand side is a map I think that you probably saw, or you could see if you go to the website Caitlin shared. This is MAPC's in 2010. They used Landsat data to model the urban temperatures that we see across the MAPC region. And this is quite helpful, but there are two things about this map that we were looking to try to improve upon. One is that these are surface temperatures, as you heard from Caitlin. So that's kind of the temperature that you would get if you were to touch the surface of the ground. And we wanted to find out the temperature that people are experiencing and then look at ambient temperature. Second of all, this is frozen at one time whenever the satellite goes over. And so we're trying to get a temperature sort of record of what happens over time to a person over the span of a hot day. And so this led to the campaign Wicked Hot Boston that we talked about. And to do this, we were part of a large-scale NOAA-funded project that used a method that was developed by researchers at Portland State University and the Science Museum of Virginia, in which sensors are mounted to vehicles and driven along traverses by citizen scientists. We had about 50 of them who map locations 3 times during a day, driving in 10 areas that were selected for transects over a period of an hour each. So these people gave up their time on a very hot day when the average temperature for Boston is projected to be over 90 degrees. As you'll hear about, we exceeded that on that day. And we mobilized these people to help get these data sets that then were used for spatial modeling using satellite data. So what did we find? First of all, we found that there was extremely high spatial variability at a given time. And what I mean by that is that at the 3 p.m. time, we had people drive at 6 a.m., 3 p.m., and 7 p.m. At the 3 p.m. time, the hottest temperature we recorded was in Ashmont, and it was 102 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll show you that in just a moment. And the coolest temperature was 87 degrees Fahrenheit near the Chestnut Hill Reservoir. So a very big variability in terms of what people are experiencing at the sub-block level. And you can see some of the hot spots that we're talking about here. The hottest areas tended to be sort of a magic combination of highways, unshaded spaces, a lack of green space, and areas further away from water. And so just one example, as I mentioned, the hottest area was this spot near the Ashmont MBTA station. And I'll show you another picture of it in just a moment. And as I said, it was about 15 degrees warmer than the coolest temperature measured by citizen scientists and then modeled using the satellite data at that time. So here's what that looks like. I pulled the data into Google Earth and then allowed you to see the street view. And I can tell you I was actually one of the people driving around at this time in a not very well air-conditioned borrowed car. And 102 degrees feels pretty hot. And you can see that there are these hot spots that pop up, as Caitlin said, and they help us learn a little bit about urban planning and what can be done. This is a really good example of this. Here's a spot that we did this in Brookline, because we did this mapping in 3 locations: the city of Boston, the town of Brookline, and the city of Cambridge. And the urban planners worked with us to determine these mapping routes. This location was fascinating to me as we combed through the data, because the hottest location and the coolest location in Brookline were about 9 degrees different at the same time, and they were about 500 yards from each other. It's this area that some of you may actually have gone to if you've driven down Route 9, and it's near a water body and a green space, and it really gives us a sense of how important these urban planning decisions are for these microclimates and what people experience during heat waves. To go along with this mapping experience, we also brought in a sense of the qualitative. So we used a citizen science project to complement our mapping called I See Change. It's kind of like Instagram for climate change, and it lets you take a picture of what you experience and make an observation that gets pinned to meteorological data, either from the closest weather station or satellite data. And we use this to get a sense of what people were experiencing and invite everyone who participated in either the heat mapping or this campaign to a forum. So this is a picture of our Wicked Hot Boston forum that happened in September of last year. We invited urban planners to present the data. That's Kara from the city of Brookline. And the lower left-hand corner, you can see Nancy Smith from the city of Boston Public Health Commission. And we had people from each of these towns interacting with citizen scientists and members of the general public to talk about what can be done from these vulnerabilities that we helped identify through this study. On the right-hand side, you can see that the city is actually taking this information. So this is a picture from the recent update to the Climate Ready Boston report, and you can see that they're using the data which they've included now into the Climate Ready Boston Explorer that you can download from the city website. Very quickly, I'm almost done. I just want to echo what Caitlin said about social vulnerabilities. So what we started doing is comparing these modeled values to social vulnerabilities that were identified by Adia Martin's study of the Climate Ready Boston report a few years ago. And so these are just a couple of examples of parameters, and you can see some pretty high correlations between, for example, people of color or people who are elderly. We are also looking at percentage of households with children or percentage of households with low English proficiency. And we can see that a lot of these same hotspots are also places where there are cumulative exposures or other kinds of socioeconomic factors that can help us figure out how to mitigate these heat in a way that might really be able to address some of these accumulating or cascading inequities. The last thing I'll say is that this is part of a much larger project. We're actually doing these kinds of citizen science activities at 28 science museums around the country across 4 hazards: heat, flooding from a sea level rise, extreme precipitation, and drought. And you can go to this website, SciStarter, which is a citizen science website aggregating people together, to learn more about that and find out what your local science museum is doing. And I want to stop there. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, David. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think I'm very impressed by the speed with which this information is getting from the ground or the air, so to speak, to the city and into the maps and into the decision-making process. Our next speaker, just moving this along and we'll get to all the questions at the end, is Mike Walsh, a friend and colleague and a senior associate with the Cadmus Group. He is currently leading the Massachusetts decarbonization study, which is a very important study that will tell us how Commonwealth-wide we're going to get to some significant carbon reduction goals. Prior to Cadmus, he was at Boston University's Institute for Sustainable Energy and was a technical lead on the Carbon Free Boston report. So Mike? Mike, you are muted.
I am muted. I'm now unmuted, I hope, and I am switching over my screen. And we are up and live.
Yep, looks good.
Any moment? Okay. Great.
Well, it did looks good. Look good. Now it looks black to me, at least. There we go.
Are we seeing the presenter view or the?
No, the notes view.
Oh. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Amy, for that great introduction. And again, thank you and the Green Ribbon Support Commission for your support of a lot of our efforts here in the Boston area to focus on decarbonization. I'm going to take a little bit of a pivot from the prior 2 speakers who were focused primarily on the adaptation and resiliency side to talk about the mitigation and planning side, of which Amy alluded to the Carbon Free Boston work that we collaborated on that sort of formed some of the insights that I hope to present here today, and I hope you will all find insightful. So I am a senior associate at the Cadmus Group. We are a consultancy with offices here in Boston, but also around the country and a couple global offices as well, where we focus on a number of areas, but we have a rich practice in the area of sustainability and energy, working with a lot of local and state level governments on developing their decarbonization strategies. So we have been working on a lot of climate action plans for counties and cities and states, state of Massachusetts being one. And we're observing and participating, I think, in a new trend towards rethinking about how we conduct these and integrating issues such as social equity even deeper into how we sort of do these analysis. Certainly data has, more data is available to us these days to provide us with deeper insights into, how to help these cities and towns decarbonize over the next 30 years. So let me just start off with some background here. On the left-hand side of the screen is sort of how a lot of cities and towns over the last 10 years, and a number of other entities as well, have been approaching climate action planning, a wedge diagram in which you basically separate out different sectors of economic and energy activity and map out how you get down to 0 by 2050. The results have been, the resolution here has typically been coarse, focused on annual steps, and focused on sort of aggregate emissions reductions and aggregate mitigation efforts. But as we talk about deep decarbonization, which includes elements such as going 100% renewable energy, to deep electrification, to battery storage, you start to see an emergence of a much more, what I would say, messier picture. And when I made up this graph, I thought about sending it over to our graphics department. But I think to clean up a little bit, but I want to actually hit home that the story here is that we are in now a messier transition conceptually, or at least much more complicated transition in which a lot of different activities are driving or will drive us down to zero and potentially even negative greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So getting those renewable energy sources online, pursuing thermal electrification, thinking about flexible loads and vehicle to grid charging, demand response, power to gas, power to hydrogen, power to liquid fuels, and then also thinking about our land and land use and how that plays into decarbonization strategies. And these strategies are a lot more interactive, and they build off of each other. And by planning effectively requires integrating all these strategies at the hourly and distributed scale resolution. It requires finer level of detail, hourly load analysis, refined geospatial resolution, and this is where we're working with a lot of our clients and partners in sort of trending towards figuring out how to put all these solutions together to tell a story about how these towns and cities can get to zero by 2050. And I want to just talk to you today a little bit as a case study in the thermal electrification space. But before I do that, I want to just highlight another element of this increasing focus on social equity and climate action planning. And I think the Carbon Free Boston Social Equity Report was a great example of really trying to integrate equity thinking in terms of how we're going to sort of reach these goals of deep decarbonization. And it's going to be challenging. And we identified that as the main issue in the report, that across a number of sectors, it will be challenging to get there. One of our analyses actually looked at the number of renters and income levels across the city to basically parse out what buildings are going to be easier to retrofit and what buildings are going to be harder to retrofit. And you can see a lot more harder to retrofit buildings are smattered across the city of Boston, primarily in those lower income neighborhoods and communities, those vulnerable communities. And this is something that I encourage you to look at the Social Equity Report for more background and detail on. But it just highlighted the challenge as we need to electrify a number of these households and homes and multifamily buildings, touching all these points and dealing with the various cultural and technical and economic barriers to change is going to be a large challenge, and we need to be attuned to sort of those factors as well as the technical factors to facilitate this change. And I want to note that this is something that was very much on our mind as part of this whole process. As we think about this transition and shifting from natural gas or oil to fossil fuels, this is going to impact. This has from natural gas or oil and other fossil fuels to electrified technologies like heat pumps. We really wanted to be mindful of the impact that that transition has on some of our lowest income constituents here in Boston. And you'll see in this figure that we're showing that the lowest income renters and homeowners bear a large burden of their income. A large portion of their income actually goes to paying energy costs. That's those dark blue lines that are there. Even though on average, the average annual energy cost of their buildings or their homes that they live in are actually pretty uniform across the city. So this is, as we go down this path of electrifying, this is one thing that we want to be cognizant about going forward. And so the two strategies that are sort of emerging here in terms of building decarbonization are electrification, so adding heat pumps. So you'll see the outdoor units that go alongside the indoor mini splits right there on the left, versus renewable natural gas, in which most folks won't have to do a large infrastructure investment. They'll just one day we would assume that the utilities would just potentially switch over to that. The challenge is we can electrify thermal loads now at scale, but we probably won't see that renewable natural gas until after 2040. However, electrification right now requires upfront retrofit costs that are mostly moderate, but a lot of people lack familiarity with those systems. That renewable natural gas approach doesn't typically require any retrofit costs, and those systems are somewhat familiar to people. And this is basically effectively the barrier that we have, and the barrier that we need to be cognizant about as we try to decarbonize these systems, especially when issues of social equity arise. Ultimately, it's those heat pumps that are going to have lower operating costs and potentially lower the life cycle cost of those systems compared to those combustion-based systems. And then we see that electrification also potentially delivers lower air quality, indoor air quality benefits, particularly if you start talking about replacing gas furnaces with, gas stoves with electric top cooking equipment. And just to finally note is we need more data in this space. Certainly there are publicly available permit and rebate data sources. The graph on the left, on the right, coming from the Carbon Free Boston Social Equity Report, just highlights the limited number of heat pump installs within the city of Boston, and the fact that most of them are occurring in sort of areas that are sort of rapidly gentrifying across the city, and we see less heat pump installs in other places like East Boston and Dorchester. That data is available, and it can aid in terms of helping cities prioritize and identify how fast some of these communities are decarbonizing, and it helps to direct some of these decarbonizing strategies. But sometimes we might find that additional data shows us some things that we might not have realized, and may show us that some of these changes might conflict with some of our equity goals. This is a figure from Chicago, just outside of Chicago, in which some researchers actually looked at the load profiles, the hourly energy use associated with different communities outside of Chicago. And what they identified was that the more well-off communities, the higher income communities, had these higher peak trends. And this is the blue line here and the blue dots in this figure, whereas the lower income communities had less of a peaky electricity load, the red line here. And it's actually more effective from a decarbonization strategy to invest in lowering the peak, flattening this curve up here, so to say, than to invest down here. But that obviously conflicts with some of the equity goals that a community might have. And so identifying this data or identifying these dynamics really help you to sort of parse out better policies and devise better strategies for potentially mitigating both emissions, but also prioritizing some of your sort of other priorities, including lowering the energy burden for some of your low-income communities. So again, we need some of those more data resources and partnerships amongst our cities and utilities to get us there. With that, there's always more we can go into with data, and I'd be happy to talk about it at the happy hour after here. But I see that my time is up, and thank you for your attention here today, and signing on.
Great, thank you, Mike. I'm going to move us directly along to Evan Curis, who is the program manager of BU's Urban Graduate Program, which is the Urban Biogeoscience and Environmental Health Program. Evan himself is a BU graduate and has spent time working on various environmental and educational programs in places as far-flung as Springfield, Massachusetts, Ecuador, Phoenix, Milwaukee. I think he's got broad experience in figuring out how to partner academics with field research, and look forward to hearing what you're working on right now here in Boston, Evan.
Well, thank you very much, Amy, for that introduction. My screen share, does that look good?
It does indeed.
Excellent. Well, I'm really thrilled to be here today, and it's inspiring to hear about the work that MAPC and the Museum of Science and the Cadmus Group are doing, and thinking about what we can do to train the next generation climate workforce to address these complex challenges. And with that, I'm really excited to tell you about BU Urban, which is a National Science Foundation, or NSF, research traineeship program for PhD students at Boston University. And our goal is to equip students with the skills help cities tackle environmental challenges. In fact, BU Urban is one of more than 80 similar programs funded by the National Science Foundation throughout the US, all with the same goal of transforming higher education to be more interdisciplinary, inclusive, and geared toward preparing graduates for a variety of career paths. Any of our speakers today show what you could achieve through academia, and we're excited to train our students to do that. So as you heard Amy say, our focus is on biogeoscience and environmental health. So topics like climate change, air pollution, wastewater are all in our wheelhouse. There's a lot that we do as a program, but the main, a big cornerstone of that is our partnerships with government, NGOs, and the private sector. We facilitate these partnerships with our urban trainees, as we call them. And these are a big priority of NSF since they expose trainees to different career paths, leveraging the research expertise to help solve complex problems. It's great to be on this panel with Mike Walsh since one of our trainees is actually working with Cadmus right now. I don't know if that's just a small world or shows like how intimately we're all connected here. But connecting PhD students with civic actors to get stuff done isn't necessarily that simple. We've heard about how much data is out there and also how we need more data, and sometimes you need PhD students bring unique skill sets to solve problems using those data. Finding partnerships requires creativity, patience, humility. So I wanted to share 3 stories of partnerships and then conclude with some lessons learned that hopefully will be useful for everyone. And the slides I'm about to share were made by the trainees themselves. So thank you. They're all here on the call and will be here during the happy hour. So the first story I want to tell is from trainee Luca Moriali in the Department of Environmental Health. He worked with the town of Arlington on a tree planting project. And Arlington, like many municipalities, spends significant resources on their street tree canopy. And while people in Arlington love their trees, the town wanted to better incorporate the idea of ecosystem services into their decision making. Currently, trees are planted when someone requests them or if there's an empty tree pit. But there's been a lot of research, especially out of BU, trying to really understand exactly how trees change urban areas and what benefits they provide depending on where you put them and how they grow. One key benefit is the ability to cool and shade parts of cities, which David alluded to. And so Luca, working with Arlington, created this heat map. With redder parts are hotter. This looks similar to what David showed us for Boston. And so Luca was able to help the town figure out where the best place to plant trees was so that it could have the greatest cooling impact. In other words, it give you the greatest bang for your buck. Luca used other studies that were out there in order to create this data set and help Arlington create a toolkit for figuring out where to plant their trees in order to provide the most benefit, so that there's this partnership between where community members want trees and where the city can get the most value for putting those trees. The next partnership story I want to share is with 2 trainees, Sarah Beth Buckley from Earth and Environment and Kate Connolly from the Department of Environmental Health. And they worked with the Boston University Academy, which is a high school on the BU campus. And their goal was to understand and quantify indoor CO2 and evaluate its use for a rooftop garden. So in schools, children breathe out CO2 and it moves through vents onto roofs, and getting rid of CO2 improves air quality inside buildings and can also increase the growth of plants if there were any on the roof. And so their question was, how much does this ventilation improve air quality inside classrooms, and how much of it could be used to improve rooftop gardens on top of this school? So before I talk more about it, I just want to say this was a really neat project because it brought together 2 trainees in different departments at BU so they could contribute different expertise to this. So Sarah Beth, so what do we have here? Sorry, I lost my thought for a second. So we have, oh, that's why I'm on the wrong slide. I talked about the partnership between the students. And they were really fortunate to work with BU Academy, which provided the space to grow plants, store materials, move supplies, and troubleshoot. They provided access to all their classrooms, allowed them to install sensors and information about the building and HVAC system. Sarah Beth and Kate were also thrilled to work with the students, show them the rooftop gardens, give talks to the schools, to provide informational materials, and even do some decorating in collaboration with UMass Institute of Art. So they're still working on their data analysis, but their goal is to provide BU Academy with information about the efficiency of their ventilation system and guidelines for how to improve rooftop gardening in the future. Pretty creative use of skill sets. All right, one more example I want to share is from Dave Reynolds in our Department of Statistics. He worked with BioBot Analytics, which is a startup based in Somerville. And you may have heard about BioBot from the news. They've been focused on estimating the amount of opioids in wastewater. And they've recently transitioned to look at rates of COVID in wastewater using sensors in the sewage system. So Dave is a statistics student with an expertise in Bayesian statistics, and BioBot wanted to work with him to improve the estimates of opioid use among a population in a sewage catchment area. With any inference, you have uncertainty about how much, in this case, opioids you might have in a population, and Dave's skill set was useful in assessing that uncertainty by developing a novel statistical model that basically added error bars to BioBot's estimates to help them make better policy recommendations. Previously, BioBot had been basing their estimates on one drug and one or two studies, and using Bayesian statistics, Dave was able to help them look at all the studies that were out there and combine them in order to make a much more certain estimate with greater degree of certainty, which can make better policy recommendations. So these three examples are rather wide ranging, but what they all show is that that PhD students can help organizations leverage data sets and sensors to create novel solutions. And I think what I want to end with is that for our students, the real difference comes in a change of norms and expectations. They're expected to form these partnerships and from the beginning of their entrance into the program. And so when they are in conversation with partners, they're always thinking about how can I be useful? Amy, in the beginning, you said, like, how do we get science into the hands of the people? And we need our PhD students and our science students to always be thinking about how is this going to be useful, rather than just, how am I going to contribute to broader scientific knowledge? Because we have this partnership model embedded in our program, students are always thinking about that. And that changes the questions that they're interested in asking and who they want to work with. So I'm excited to see that graduate education is changing in this way at BU and across the US. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of these programs and partnerships come into fruition. I hope you'll stick around for the happy hour where you'll meet our trainees. And I just want to put in a final plug. You can hear even more about our trainees at our symposium on May 19th. There's a link here, and I'll drop another one in the Q&A. And with that, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you very much, Amy.
Great, thank you, Evan. We have only about 9 minutes, and all of those presentations were really interesting, and a couple of them about really hands-on data gathering and how you organize people, and a couple about what do you do with the data at a very high level. So I think I'm going to try to see if I can get at least one question in for each of our panelists, and maybe start with David. I'm going to ask, you're going to get two because you've got a couple of really specific questions about your program, like can high school students volunteer for the program, and how. And then a couple of questions about how good is the quality of the data if you're asking, just regular people to go out and take the temperature.
I mean, yeah, so a couple of things. It's a great question. So with respect to youth, yes, the answer is yes. We had youth volunteer, and we're hoping to expand this in partnership with MAPC, City of Boston, and we're hoping maybe even do a Wicked Hot Mystic campaign, if not this summer when it seems unlikely, then next summer, along some of these communities that Caitlin named as potential places where we see hotspots, expanding it throughout MAPC's metro region, maybe eventually. And so it would be great to have youth participating in that. In terms of the data quality, it depends on the citizen science project. With this particular project, really the most important thing is that the sensors take really good data, and then the analysis and the modeling. I didn't explain it very well, but basically they backcast where the traverses were taken with the model data, and there was really, really high correlations between the model and what was recorded, which is affirming of this methodology that was pioneered by these people in Oregon and the Science Museum of Virginia. More broadly, citizen science projects are often a trade-off between the amount of data that you get and the individual quality of the data that you might get in a smaller experiment. That's not necessarily true here, but it is true, for example, for projects like we're leading, where we have people go out and take, inundation photos during wicked high tide events, like the one that's happening right now. Last night, people went out and took pictures, or are taking pictures of storm damage of the high tide that we're in. And the idea is that by having so much data, you're able to take advantage of that, and there's trade-offs and affordances of that kind of work. But citizen science is an increasingly large way to get people involved, both in documenting vulnerabilities and envisioning solutions.
Yeah, and I was wondering, as I prepared for this panel, is it also a way to collect data less expensively than some other methodologies?
I think it definitely can be, depending on what you're doing. There's no question about that. You also can get sorts of data that you just can't get in other places. I would argue that it's not just the quality of the data in terms of what you get in terms of numbers, but also the potential for also tapping into these people as potential decision makers and contributing their values and their experiences. The IC Change campaign we talked about that we did in parallel with the driving around, we wanted to get a sense of how this was affecting people in these communities. And so there's kind of an interesting sort of qualitative narrative data set that you can get if you allow these people to share what they're seeing and feeling, and they can also put quality checks on the data in that way as well.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, so then there's another question. It's come in a few different ways. I'm going to do my best to kind of consolidate it and roll it all together, and maybe start with Caitlin. I'll probably manage to get everyone's true interest wrong here, but we're going to give it a try. And it has to do with trees and the importance of trees, and I think water we also saw in David's presentation. And then Evan, you talked about the tree planting work. The importance of vegetation and water and natural is to keeping the environment down, and the temperature down, and we also know that trees serve a CO2 absorptive capacity and a water. In some cases, they actually absorb water as well and keep the soil in place and so forth. So how do you sort of take all of the, how do you roll that into land use planning and then balance that against our very real need for development in the Boston region?
If we're starting with me, that's a really big question.
I tried.
I think vegetation is a great lever in our toolbox for cooling our urban areas and keeping the development that we create cool. I think retrofits are one way we can do that. I mean, a landscape architect would be much more qualified to speak about this, but I think projects like the one Evan mentioned, to think about how we can integrate vegetation into perhaps the roofs of our buildings in a way that even brings down CO2 levels inside, is a great option. I think thinking about where and how to plant street trees so that they have the most effect and the most longevity and are really working actively as carbon sinks is also great, and also going to really promote the sort of stormwater benefits there. So perhaps not the most specific answer, but I think there are a lot of ways that vegetation can be incorporated alongside growth.
Anyone else want to jump in on that of the other panelists?
Yeah, I'll just say there's so much
Evan.
We know and about how trees work in cities and don't know too, but this question of how they cool and how people value them, but also how they're affected by things like gas leaks, and air pollution. There's a lot that goes into tree planting decisions, and it's exciting that we're seeing more partnerships between tree planting organizations or municipalities and researchers to figure out what priorities are and how we can maximize them with the research that we have. I want to plug in kind of a cool partnership that we've been part of at BU Urban with Speak for the Trees Boston.
I was just going to mention them. They're wonderful.
Yeah, so we started a kind of a weekly conversation series with them, pairing one of our trainees that are doing work around the urban forest and a practitioner. So we've worked with Arnold Arboretum. Last week we met with HEAT, the nonprofit, and so we've had a lot of conversations about how research and practice go together to advance the urban forest. And so I think one answer I have is that we should be working towards these goals, but in partnership with others, researchers, community members, and we have good models of that here.
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question before it tells us it's time to go to happy hour. And Mike, this is for you, and it's about heat pumps. And when heat pumps are used for cooling in dense urban areas, what impact are they going to have on increasing the urban heat island effect? You're on mute.
So that's a great question, and I think it's a one thing I glossed over is in terms of retrofitting buildings, as we get more exposed to higher temperatures in the coming years, adding a heat pump to buildings that never had air conditioning will certainly provide a cooling effect for those internal occupants of those buildings, which is one way to help mitigate that stress. Undoubtedly, that increases overall energy use, but heat pumps are relatively efficient even as AC units, and the energy that they're going to sort of be dumping into the local environment will be modest, but there are a number of mitigating strategies to help handle that as well. More efficient building envelopes, but also just adding more trees to a given area to be a small contribution overall that can easily be mitigated by other strategies.
Okay, great. We are at time. I would just like to say that this has been absolutely fascinating to see the different levels at which this kind of work takes place, and equally important, involving people in the collection of this very important data, and having and hearing the stories and being able to put the qualitative stories, sort of like pin it onto the data that then gets aggregated and used at the level Mike and Caitlin are working at, which is statewide. That you've really illustrated for us the interplay between those different parts of the climate policy building apparatus. So thank you all very much. Thank our scientists, to our panelists who are scientists, Caitlin, David, Evan, and Mike, and again to BARI and to Northeastern for having us this afternoon. Dan?
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Caitlin, David, Michael, Evan, and thank you so much, Amy, for kind of leading us through here. A wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it. I had a bunch of reactions going through. I mean, one of them was simply that, the richness of the data that was presented here. And it's striking to me, it's something I've been thinking about a lot with the pandemic lately, how, some of these shifts and changes and impacts that we think about as being global, as hitting everybody, are hitting some neighborhoods harder than others. And that's just, that's very challenging to think about. And how do we support communities exactly in what they're experiencing? So I thought that was really rich. And the other piece I said at the top, right? This is just great examples of how we can co-create as a broader research policy community, and bring all expertise to the table and really accomplish something collectively as a region. And so very, very exciting. I hope this conversation between these individuals and everyone else who is on the panel continues in the coming weeks and months and years, and we really get somewhere. So with that said, everyone, please join us again next week for week 4. We will be talking about supporting the vulnerable few, moderated by Eric Estevez, the executive director of the Lenny Zakem Fund. And right now, we're going to go to the BARI happy hour. So if people could join us, I believe it's been posted in the Q&A, but bit.ly/BARI happy hour, spelled exactly as it sounds. And we very much look forward to seeing you there. And if you can't join us, we will see you next week. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll see you then.